Joining us on the program is Sabrina Fernandes. Sabrina, thank you very much for making the time.
Thanks, Will. It's a pleasure to be here. I was part of writing. I wrote a little bit for Africa as a Country last year, so it's nice to be on the podcast as well.
Yeah, it's great. And I mean, I'm going to reference your piece a lot, which was about how Lula could set the bar higher for a new presidency. At the time, we were all hoping that he would win. That came to pass. He has won. That was a watershed moment for the left internationally. But it hasn't been without its own problems. And the one key event I want to talk about, which happened fairly recently, was what occurred on the 8th of January when Bolsonaristas, supporters of ex-President Jair Bolsonaro, effectively stormed federal government buildings in Brasilia, the Congress, the presidential palace. And this has invited a lot of comparison to a similar event we saw in the United States of America 2 years prior, when on the 6th of January, supporters of Donald Trump stormed the US Capitol. Now, on the one hand, one doesn't want to concede the analogy because it just feels like we're giving America too much centrality when it comes to interpreting world events that may or may not be similar. But it does seem incredibly similar, especially considering the level of coordination, the ways in which a lot of it, the mobilization happened was through conspiracy theory, different social media channels, and so on and so forth. So could you walk us through what happened on that day? And since that day, has there been any action taken to hold those responsible accountable, which is something we haven't really seen in the January 6th incident in the United States?
Yes. Well, the temptation to draw the comparison is actually part of the reason why we're using this, because Bolsonaro was drawing the comparison. When the invasion into Capitol happened, and later on, like, there's been a lot of movement coming from the Bolsonarista camp in terms of thinking of these people on Capitol Hill as heroes, like they were standing up because Biden stole the election and things like that. So that kind of narrative actually went from the US into Brazil, and there are connections between Bolsonarismo and Trumpism. They are not just in terms of, well, they look alike. Over the past years, I resisted a lot this practice coming from international media saying that, for example, that Bolsonaro was the Trump from the tropics. This is a little too much for me because it actually denies the roots of Bolsonarismo. It denies its own particular characteristics, especially because, well, for example, in Brazil, we're talking about the role of fundamentalist religious positions with the evangelicals in Brazil. This is a lot tighter, and the role of the military in Brazil, the fact that we came from the military dictatorship, but also the very fact that, well, we're talking about a country in Latin America that has been subject to imperialist interventions and influence for a really long time. So I find that sort of comparison between Trump and Bolsonaro to be a little shallow, but the events of January 6th and then January 8th, they do have similarities in the sense that the people involved in Brazil drew inspiration. That was a conversation. But then we have big differences here. I think the major difference is the fact that, well, Biden was not yet president in the US. Lula was already president in Brazil. Lula had been president for a whole week. So the way that the state responded to the situation mattered a lot. And in the case of Brazil, it took about 3 hours for us to get actual federal response into it. Most of it, we understand, that was due to a delay at the local level. So the government of the federal district, where the capital Brasilia is, it is a Bolsonarista government. So I used to live there. So the governor, Ibanez Rocha, is well known for being Bolsonarista. He's very rich. His police is actually very ruthless towards protesters usually. Again, I've been there. So the situation is quite bad usually, and the police was basically just escorting these protesters that we're actually calling attackers and invaders nowadays. Part of the Brazilian press has been calling them terrorists. I resist this naming, because I think there's quite a difference between what was happening since Lula got elected and January 8th in terms of the levels of action planned by these people. So as soon as Lula got elected, a bunch of them started camping in front of army headquarters, and I'll talk about the role of the military in just a second. And they started blocking roads and doing things like that. At this point, this is actually not quite different from things that the left would do in terms of action, blocking a road in order to apply pressure. The difference is the content, right? So in the fact here, this is very an anti-democratic content, alleging fraud when there wasn't fraud, things like that. And then we started getting to a more complicated scenario. So for example, in December, so when Lula was getting certified by the electoral court as president, there was like an amount of Bolsonaristas in Brasilia as well. They started setting random cars on fire, and they set, for example, a bus on fire, and they wanted to put a bunch of kitchen gas tanks close to the bus that could have caused like a horrible explosion in a place where there were a lot of hotels, right? And it was close to the hotel where Lula was staying and working. So this starts escalating. And then we found out about plans of bombs to explode the airport in Brasilia and other calls like that. That's something that we can classify closer to terrorism. What happened on January 8th, it was an attack. They destroyed everything. But also we had a pretty excellent team of workers led by Lula and the First Lady as well, Janja, who put most that they could together again, but there's a lot of loss, right? So we're talking about millions of reais and like pieces of art that can't really be fixed in that way. But so there were attackers. But the role of the military here is important. And this is something that Lula is finally making moves on. At first, there was this trust that, well, these people might come in and they might do something. Well, but the local government's there, the police is there, the army is there. They're going to work on it. That's in fact not what happened. I have been to protests in Brazilian countless times in my life, and we can't get close the way that they got close to the buildings. There weren't enough police people there, and the scenes were actually quite pathetic. If you look in that sense, like we have scenes, for example, of like cops just sitting around buying coconut water when people were just doing whatever they were doing. So it took the federal government a while to finally click in and say, oh, wait, we need to intervene. They're not going to do this. So then they issued like a decree for federal intervention in the security area of the federal district. And that means this is still ongoing. And then they were able to actually bring enough of security force to be able to drive the people aside. They arrested a lot of people right away. So there were about 1,500 arrests, and the people started getting processed. There's still some people who have gone already into the penitentiaries in Brazil. Others are under home arrest. So there's been a lot of stuff going on in relation to that. But what matters really here is like the people who were calling the shots. And here we have another difference between the US and Brazil. Bolsonaro was actually in Florida. Yeah, so like Bolsonaro was actually not there, and he wasn't really calling in the sense that this is a coup, we're taking over because I'm the rightful president of Brazil. He didn't do that. Actually, we didn't have like any proper leadership calling into power. So again, I resist calling this in an attempt at a coup. Probably a lot of them thought that, well, we're going to take this back, but without like a proper leadership and a hierarchy here saying we're going to hold on to this power. I think it's more like wishful thinking in the sense of saying, yes, we were attacked and a coup almost happened. It could have almost happened, but
what explains that? What explains Bolsonaro's very subdued response? I mean, he was alike to Trump in the sense that after Lula's election, he didn't outrightly concede defeat. He was not present for Lula's inauguration, didn't participate in the handover and the symbolic transfer of power. But even given his absence from all of the processes which would mark the transfer of power, as you said, he's been hiding out in Florida and kind of in self-imposed exile, quite pathetically, sort of playing video games.
The photo of him eating a KFC during Lula's inauguration. What was that?
Exactly that. So this is not someone who is sort of in the wake of defeat, rallying his forces for one final push. He just seems sort of drained of any of his energy and vitality. And yeah, what explains that? There was a lot of talk prior to Lula's victory that Bolsonarismo was going to have this resurgence after Lula would come to power. And January 8th seemed like it was an indication of that. But since then, given just how quiet Bolsonaro is, it's hard to gauge whether he himself wants to have a legacy once his presidency is ended. He kind of seems like someone who just wants to live out the remainder of his existence playing video games and eating KFC.
Well, I think there's a point here again, like in terms of a difference between the US and Brazil. Bolsonaro has committed so many crimes of all kinds that he's really afraid of being arrested. This is the main thing. And if he does get arrested, probably his whole family is going to get arrested too, because they've all been involved in different levels of what has been happening in Brazil. So we're talking about corruption scandals here. We're talking here right now. There's a very strong conversation in Brazil around the crime of genocide against the Yanomami indigenous peoples. The way that the Bolsonaro government handled this situation. Some people have been calling omission. For me, it goes beyond omission. It was on purpose, the things that they were doing in order to benefit illegal mining in the region, mostly illegal mining connected to gold. And so he's really afraid of like being taken to the courts, not only in Brazil, but also outside of Brazil. And obviously, there are some people who have made claims that, for example, if Bolsonaro goes back to Brazil and gets arrested, this is going to awake a lot of these other Bolsonaristas who are going to think, wow, this is really unfair, and they're going to take it to the streets again. But the fact is that we find that Bolsonarism is still strong in terms of a percentage of people. Like I wrote a short piece for NACLA on this, that we were looking at some of the polls right after January 8th in Brazil, and they're still not just like complete full support for what happened, but people are like, yeah, it's kind of justified, right? Because, maybe Lula didn't really win the elections. So this level of skepticism, the doubts that were sold in Brazilian society, this is quite strong. So like my main concern is that we still have a lot of depoliticization around the elections and this lack of trust in Lula as a legitimate president. I think this is something that we need to worry about, because this goes beyond these very radical Bolsonaristas. And we do understand like Bolsonarismo as a phenomenon is already, radicalized. It has roots around Nazism. It has conversations around eugenics, all sorts of things like that. But the level of action that the supporters are willing to engage with, this obviously differs. So like some people are more fanatical, and the level of fanatism, it varies from like how involved you are organized within Bolsonarismo, but also people who have been completely affected by this mentality over the past years, and they are vulnerable. And you have like big people from agribusiness, business people in general, like providing financial support to people who were camping in front of these army headquarters. So we have like reports of people who actually like got evicted from their homes after the election because they stopped paying rent. They moved to the front of these headquarters. They've been camping out. They have nowhere else to go. So this level of vulnerability, the impact in terms of like, cognitive capacities, even there are like psychologists working on this right now. So there are a lot of elements here that show that Bolsonarism is still quite present, but the level of support and penetration is fragmented, and it's not enough for what Bolsonaro hoped in order to hold on to power. to just claim, well, this is a fraudulent election, I'm going to stay. He actually never conceded. He never made a speech conceding. He was not there for the inauguration. But for example, right after the invasion, he went on and he posted some tweets, and he actually said, well, the current chief of the executive of Brazil, Lula. So he's coming into terms with the fact that he's no longer president of Brazil. But then it comes to the point of the military. The military is key here, because a lot of the power that Bolsonaro drew was from the military. He put a lot of key military people within civilian posts in government. He understood that the heads of the military in Brazil, like if we look into the armed forces in general, they were with him. In fact, there have been tensions in the past. We know that the armed forces in Brazil are not completely Bolsonarista, but the Bolsonarist ideology is strong. But there were tensions like a couple of years ago when Bolsonaro was already fighting with the Supreme Court, that we got reports that when all of the chiefs of the armed forces quit at once, it was because Bolsonaro was asking them to fly a fighter jet very low and close to the Supreme Court in order to break all the windows. That kind of stuff, right? But it means that Lula has quite a tough job dealing with the armed forces right now. His defense minister has been very criticized, José Múcio, for not properly taking a stance, being kind of treating the camps as, they're just there, they're protesting, not treating them as anti-democratic forces. But Lula still thinks that he can work with Múcio around this, but he's been making changes. So he made a change in terms of like the chief of the army in Brazil. He actually fired a lot of people recently. So there are certain things happening, perhaps a little slower than what people expected, like after January 8th, how bad it was. But things are ongoing, and I feel like Lula is trying to thread the waters carefully here as well, because he knows that he doesn't have enough support in the military. And he knows that he has to win Brazilians over as well by saying, yes, I am your legitimate president. I am going to govern for you all. And these were fair elections. Actually, we should actually make a point. They were as fair as we could get in terms of winning. But, well, Bolsonaro tried to steal this election all the time, right? So it was a very tough campaign for us.